I did not retrieve this recording through standard archival channels. It arrived already active. The tape was found seated in a portable emergency receiver recovered from a decommissioned communications annex 3 levels below ground, in a facility whose call sign no longer appears in any federal registry. Power to the building had been cut for decades. The receiver was not connected to an antenna. The batteries were corroded beyond use. And yet, when the unit was cataloged and powered down for intake, the tape counter continued to advance. That discrepancy was the first notation I made. The frequency associated with this recording belongs to a legacy emergency broadcast channel established during the early redundancy era. Its purpose was singular and, according to surviving documentation, absolute. The channel was designed to activate only after the confirmed absence of all human-initiated transmissions. Not failure, not disaster. Absence. It was never intended to be monitored. Vault 13 does not normally retain active frequencies. We store artifacts, not signals. This file should have been erased automatically had the system it belonged to still existed. Instead, it persisted. More troubling still, initial playback revealed that the transmission did not behave like a broadcast. There was no repeating loop, no instructional cadence, no identifiable sender. It paused. I am careful with that word. The pauses were not empty. They carried measurable expectation. Signal strength fluctuated subtly during periods of silence, as though awaiting confirmation that it was being heard. When no response followed, the channel adjusted. Not louder, not clearer, simply present. The tape counter does not match the recorded duration. It advances during static. It advances during silence. It advances even when the receiver is powered down. We verified this across 3 separate playback systems. The result was consistent. This file resists classification. What follows is a partial reconstruction compiled from maintenance logs, personal field notes, and a degraded monitoring tape recovered alongside the receiver. Several segments are missing. Others contradict each other. Where possible, I have preserved the original language without correction. Where that was not possible, I have annotated the absence. I should note that portions of this material appear to reference emergency protocols that no longer exist, and in some cases never formally did. Cross-references to adjacent files suggest this is not an isolated occurrence. However, those records remain sealed. One final clarification before proceeding. The channel documented here does not issue warnings. It does not request aid. It does not instruct evacuation or shelter. It does not announce catastrophe. It evaluates. Playback should be conducted without response. Any attempt to acknowledge the transmission appears to alter its behavior. I did not learn this immediately. I learned it after. What you are about to hear was never meant for human recipients. The system responsible for it does not appear to recognize the distinction anymore. I am logging this file under restricted observation. Proceed carefully. The work order reached Elias Mercer on a Tuesday morning, buried beneath routine maintenance requests and Spectrum compliance checks. It was the sort of assignment that rarely drew comment. Verify inactivity, confirm closure, update the archive. Communications Annex Delta had been officially decommissioned for more than 20 years, its purpose absorbed into newer systems and its physical footprint quietly abandoned. Most technicians treated such jobs as a formality, a box to be checked so an old line item could finally disappear from a ledger no one remembered creating. Elias accepted without hesitation. The annex sat beyond the city limits, accessible by a service road that had not been repaved in years. Weeds pressed in from both sides, brushing against the undercarriage of his vehicle as he drove. The structure itself was little more than a concrete rectangle, half sunken into the ground, its exterior stained by decades of weather and neglect. There were no signs warning trespassers away, no lights, no cameras that he could see. It looked less like a restricted facility and more like a forgotten utility building that had outlived its usefulness. Inside, the air was cool and stale, carrying the faint metallic scent of old electronics. Emergency lighting flickered to life as he descended the stairwell, illuminating corridors that had been sealed off but never dismantled. The lower levels still had power, though it arrived unevenly, humming through circuits that no longer served a clear purpose. Elias noted this with mild surprise. Most decommissioned sites were stripped down to bare concrete and silence. Annex Delta had simply been left behind. The broadcast room was intact. Racks of analog equipment lined the walls, each unit labeled in careful handwriting that had faded but not disappeared. Tape decks sat beneath receivers tuned to long-abandoned frequencies. Consoles designed to monitor dozens of channels at once stared back at him, their meters frozen at zero. Dust lay thick across every surface, undisturbed except where rodents had made brief, unsuccessful attempts to nest. Elias unpacked his kit and began the verification process. It was mechanical, almost comforting in its predictability. Power up, calibrate, sweep the spectrum, confirm the absence of signal. Everything was dead. Everything except one narrow band that pulsed faintly against the noise floor. At first, he dismissed it as interference. Old equipment was prone to quirks, especially after years of disuse. Atmospheric conditions could produce strange artifacts, so could nearby civilian transmissions bleeding into poorly shielded hardware. He marked the anomaly in his notes and continued the sweep. The signal did not move. It sat precisely where the emergency frequency associated with the annex was supposed to be, neither drifting nor fading, its presence so subtle that it would have been easy to overlook if he had not been watching the meters closely. There was no modulation, no identifiable pattern, just a steady, patient registration of activity. Elias switched receivers. The signal followed. He adjusted the antenna inputs even though the feeds had been physically disconnected years ago. No change. He powered the unit down and brought up a portable analyzer from his own equipment, battery-operated and isolated from the building systems. The signal appeared there too. That was the moment he paused, fingers hovering over the controls, irritation giving way to curiosity. It was not unheard of for legacy frequencies to pick up stray noise, but this was too precise, too consistent. He recorded a short sample to tape, more out of habit than concern, and listened back. Static. The meters still moved. He told himself it meant nothing. That night, Elias slept poorly. He dreamed of waiting rooms with no exits, of rows of chairs facing blank walls. In the dream, there was always the sense that something was about to happen, some announcement or instruction that never arrived. He woke before dawn with the impression that he had been expected somewhere and failed to show. He did not record the dream in his official log. The next day, the signal was still there. Elias spent hours attempting to characterize it. He widened the sweep, narrowed it again, compared it against known emergency tone sequences and handshake protocols. Nothing matched. The signal did not behave like a broadcast. It did not repeat. It did not cycle. It did not even fluctuate in response to environmental noise. It simply remained. Frustration crept in as the afternoon wore on. The job should have taken a single day. Verify inactivity. Close the file. Instead, he found himself cataloging an anomaly he could not explain and had no clear path to escalate. Annex Delta existed in a bureaucratic blind spot, its oversight scattered across departments that no longer communicated with each other. Late in the day, as he ran diagnostics for the third time, Elias spoke aloud without thinking. He complained about the equipment, about the assignment, about the way old systems refused to die quietly. The meter jumped. It was not a dramatic spike, just a brief, measurable increase in signal strength that coincided exactly with the sound of his voice. Elias froze, breath caught halfway through his next sentence. The signal settled back into its previous state as the room fell silent. He waited. Nothing changed. A laugh escaped him, sharp and reflexive. Coincidence, he told himself. Feedback, some odd resonance between his voice and the aging hardware. He said a few more words, louder this time, watching the meters closely. The signal responded again. Elias stopped laughing. He spent the rest of the day testing the phenomenon with a methodical care that bordered on obsession. He clapped his hands. No effect. He tapped the equipment rack. Nothing. He played recorded audio through a portable speaker. The signal did not react. Only his live voice produced a response. There was still no sound coming back through the receiver. No message. No tone. Just the meter acknowledging something it had detected and adjusting accordingly. He wrote this down in a separate notebook, distinct from the official maintenance log. He told himself it was temporary, that once he understood the behavior, he would fold the notes back into the proper documentation. That night, he did not dream at all, or if he did not remember it. On the third day, Elias began digging into the frequency's designation. The code associated with it did not appear in any modern database. He had to access archived documentation, scanned and poorly indexed, files that predated the current regulatory framework. The deeper he went, the more fragmented the records became, as though the system responsible for maintaining them had lost interest part way through the process. Eventually, he found it. The frequency was classified under a category he had only encountered once before, during training and only as a theoretical example. Conditional emergency activation. The description was sparse, almost evasive, offering no technical details and no clear chain of command. One line stood out. Activation contingent upon absence of human-initiated transmission. Elias read it twice, then a third time, the words settling uneasily in his mind. Absence, not failure, not catastrophe. Absence. He assumed it was a thought experiment, a redundancy layered so far beyond practical use that it had never been implemented. The sort of thing committees proposed to justify funding, not something anyone expected to function. Still, the phrasing bothered him. He made a note to flag it as a documentation artifact and moved on. The signal did not change. Over the following days, Elias brought in additional equipment, each piece newer and more isolated than the last. The signal persisted across all of it. He spoke less around the receivers, uneasy now with the idea that his presence alone might be influencing the system. When he remained silent for extended periods, the signal grew stronger, its baseline creeping upward in increments so small they would have been meaningless if they had not been so consistent. He left the room for several hours one afternoon, returning only after sunset. The signal had increased again. When he spoke, it dipped briefly, then stabilized at its new level. A realization took shape in his mind, unwelcome and difficult to articulate. His voice did not advance whatever process was occurring. His silence did. Elias reviewed the archived documentation again, this time with a different lens. The channel was not described as a broadcast. It was described as a confirmation system, a mechanism designed to observe something rather than announce it. One marginal note, handwritten and poorly scanned, lingered with him long after he closed the file. The system does not wait for silence. It waits for non-response. The implications were uncomfortable enough that Elias tried to rationalize them away. Perhaps the channel was meant to activate after a complete communications collapse, when no human oversight remained to confirm the state of the network. Perhaps it was simply misfiring, interpreting gaps and delays as something more significant than they were. But the behavior did not align with failure. It aligned with assessment. On the seventh day, Elias attempted isolation. He powered down the broadcast room entirely, pulling breakers and removing fuses until only his portable analyzer remained active. The signal did not weaken. If anything, it appeared clearer outside the building, registering more strongly once he stepped into open air. He contacted his supervisor and described the situation in neutral, careful terms. Persistent signal, legacy frequency, equipment behaving unexpectedly. The response was polite and dismissive. Finish the verification. File the report. There was no protocol for escalation, no department clearly responsible for a system that should not have existed in the first place. That night, Elias slept on a cot in the annex hallway. It felt wrong to leave, though he could not explain why. He woke several times, each time with the sense that something had shifted while he was unconscious. On the 10th day, he found an internal memo buried among the archives. It was marked as a draft, never finalized, its margins crowded with handwritten notes. The memo described the channel as a last record system, a way to log the end of human communication infrastructure without relying on human observers. One passage was underlined repeatedly. The system is not intended to detect life. It is intended to detect engagement. In the margin, someone had written a single question. If they are still here but no longer responding, does that count? Elias closed the file and sat in silence, listening to the faint hum of power moving through circuits that should have been dead. The signal on his analyzer remained steady, confident, as though a conclusion was slowly being reached without him. By the end of the second week, the channel no longer reacted to his voice at all. It did not need to. Elias did not mark a specific moment when concern turned into vigilance. The change arrived gradually, like the realization that a room has grown colder long after the temperature has already dropped. He continued working because that was what technicians did when systems behaved strangely. You documented. You isolated variables. You stayed until the anomaly either resolved itself or became someone else's responsibility. Neither happened. The signal settled into its new baseline and held there, steady and indifferent. Elias tested it repeatedly, speaking into the open air, whispering, raising his voice, addressing the room as if a formal declaration might provoke a response. Nothing changed. The channel no longer acknowledged him. At first, this felt like relief. The idea that his presence had been influencing the system had weighed on him more than he wanted to admit. If the channel had adjusted and moved on, then perhaps whatever feedback loop he had triggered had finally stabilized. But the relief did not last. He began to notice that the system's behavior changed during long stretches when no one was nearby. The portable analyzer logged gradual shifts in signal strength overnight. Not abrupt spikes, but smooth, deliberate increases that suggested a process unfolding at its own pace. Each morning, the baseline was marginally higher than it had been the night before. Elias told himself it was drift, aging components, some buried feedback mechanism slowly correcting itself. He did not believe that explanation for long. To test his assumptions, he instituted controlled silence. He powered down everything except the analyzer, sealed the broadcast room, and left the annex entirely for an entire day. When he returned, the signal had increased more than it ever had overnight. The trend was unmistakable. The channel did not react to his absence with uncertainty or hesitation. It responded with confidence. Elias began keeping 2 sets of notes. The official maintenance log remained professional and conservative, filled with neutral language and careful phrasing. Alongside it, he kept a personal notebook where he allowed himself to write more freely. It was in this second record that his unease became visible. He found himself describing the signal in terms that bordered on intention. waiting, adjusting, confirming. Each time he caught himself doing this, he forced himself to rewrite the entry in more technical language. Systems did not intend, they executed. And yet, the pattern continued. Several days later, Elias reviewed the analyzer logs and noticed something that made his stomach tighten. During a 12-hour period when he had remained inside the annex, but deliberately silent, the signal's increase had slowed. Not stopped, but slowed, as if the system were accounting for his proximity without granting it full significance. When he left the building entirely, the increase resumed at its previous rate. Presence mattered. Response mattered more. Elias returned to the archived documentation, this time with a focus on the people who had built the system, rather than the system itself. Names appeared sporadically, most attached to committees or working groups that no longer existed. The language in the documents grew more abstract the further back he went, as though the authors themselves were struggling to define what they were attempting. One report described the channel as a continuity witness. Another called it a final auditor of human communication. A third avoided description entirely, referring to it only as a necessary redundancy in the event of a total disengagement. There was no record of a successful test. That absence unsettled him more than any technical anomaly. Systems of this scale were tested obsessively, simulated, stressed, documented. The lack of any trial run suggested that no one had ever been certain how to verify its behavior, or that verification itself had been considered unsafe. Elias found an internal email chain preserved in the archives, its formatting mangled by age but still legible. The participants debated whether human oversight should invalidate activation. One argued that the presence of operators should be enough to keep the system dormant. Another countered that oversight without engagement was indistinguishable from absence. The final message in the chain was brief. We are not trying to prove that humans exist. We are trying to prove that they still respond. After that, the correspondence ended. The days blurred together as Elias worked and waited. He stopped driving home at night, choosing instead to sleep in the annex hallway, where he could hear the low hum of the remaining power circuits. He told himself it was practical, easier to monitor the equipment, less time wasted commuting. In truth, the thought of leaving the channel unattended made him uneasy. His dreams returned, more vivid now. He dreamed of sirens that never activated, of evacuation routes drawn on walls that led back to the same room. In one dream, he stood in front of a microphone, speaking urgently into it while a panel of lights slowly went dark, one by one, until only a single indicator remained, glowing steadily no matter what he said. He woke each time with the sense that he had failed some unspoken test. The channel's behavior grew more complex. It no longer increased steadily. Instead, it began to exhibit state changes. The signal would shift abruptly, hold for a period, then settle into a new pattern. These transitions often followed extended periods of silence across multiple frequencies, not just the one Elias monitored directly. He compared the timing of these shifts against regional broadcast logs. Civilian radio chatter continued uninterrupted. Emergency services operated normally. There was no indication of a communications collapse. The channel behaved as though those transmissions did not count. This realization forced Elias to confront an uncomfortable possibility. The system was not measuring the presence of sound. It was measuring something else. Intent. Recorded broadcasts, automated signals, and routine transmissions lacked the quality the channel seemed to be searching for. They were noise, not engagement. Only live, directed response had mattered in the beginning, and even that had eventually ceased to qualify. The system had adjusted its criteria. Elias attempted to intervene. He accessed an older control interface stored in a locked cabinet at the rear of the broadcast room. The cabinet resisted at first, its hinges stiff with disuse, then opened with a sound like tearing paper. Inside were printed manuals and emergency procedures preserved in plastic sleeves, their pages yellowed but intact. The shutdown protocol was explicit. Before initiating deactivation, the operator was required to declare active human oversight. The declaration had to be spoken aloud and recorded by the system itself. Elias hesitated, the words catching in his throat as he read them. The phrasing was archaic, formal in a way that felt ceremonial rather than technical. He told himself that was simply the style of the era. He spoke the declaration exactly as written. The signal surged. It was the strongest response he had ever recorded. A sharp, unmistakable increase followed by a brief modulation pattern that the analyzer flagged as a discrete event. The system had acknowledged him, and then it returned to its previous baseline, unchanged. Elias stood in the broadcast room long after the meter settled, the echo of his own voice lingering in the air. The shutdown sequence had not failed. It had been accepted and logged. The implication was worse. He attempted the procedure again, this time playing back a recording of the declaration while remaining silent himself. The channel ignored it entirely. Only live speech had counted, and only once. After that, silence moved the system forward more efficiently than any action he could take. Elias began to suspect that intervention itself was being interpreted as a terminal condition. The channel did not resist his attempts to shut it down. It incorporated them. The annex clocks began to disagree with each other. At first, the discrepancies were minor. A few seconds here, a minute there. Elias recalibrated them and noted the drift, assuming it was a side effect of unstable power. But the differences grew more pronounced with each passing day. One clock ran fast, another slow. A third stopped entirely without explanation. His watch remained accurate. So did the analyzer timestamps, though their relationship to real time felt increasingly abstract. Elias began labeling his notes by sequence rather than date, unsure which reference point to trust. During one review session, he noticed an entry in the official log that he did not remember writing. It described the annex as already inactive, its systems archived pending final verification. The language was his. The phrasing matched his habits exactly. The timestamp did not. He cross-referenced it with vehicle logs, access records, anything that could anchor the entry to a real moment. Nothing aligned. The entry existed in isolation, a statement of completion written before the work was done. Elias considered the possibility that he had made a mistake. Fatigue could explain a great deal. Stress, too. He was sleeping poorly, eating irregularly, spending too much time alone with equipment that refused to behave. Still, the unease lingered. The channel's signal began to resemble archival broadcasts. The cadence of its state changes felt final, as though it were summarizing rather than searching. Elias compared the pattern against known data logging systems and found unsettling similarities. This was not a live assessment anymore. It was a record being finalized. On the 29th day, Elias attempted to leave the annex. He packed his equipment, shut down what systems he could, and made his way toward the stairwell. As he moved, the emergency lighting brightened noticeably, the hum of power rising in pitch. The signal spiked. Elias stopped. The lights dimmed. The signal settled. He took another step. The response repeated. He stood perfectly still, heart pounding, waiting for his breathing to slow. When it did, the system returned to baseline. Elias did not believe the channel controlled the lights. He believed it understood movement, presence, withdrawal. He contacted his supervisor again, abandoning neutrality this time. He described the adaptive behavior, the failed shutdown, the way the system appeared to interpret his actions. There was a long silence on the line before the supervisor responded. He was told to document everything and await further instruction. No one arrived. No additional resources were sent. The annex remained his responsibility by default. The final confirmations occurred quietly. Elias did not recognize them as such at the time. Only later, reviewing the logs, did the pattern emerge. Each state change followed a prolonged absence of meaningful response across multiple channels. Each one moved the system closer to a steady, unchanging state. The channel was not escalating. It was concluding. Elias spoke into the broadcast room one last time, stating his name and role with a formality that surprised him. The system did not respond. It no longer needed his confirmation. When he checked the logs the following morning, he found another entry he did not remember writing. It recommended withdrawal. The annex was listed as inactive, archived. The handwriting was his. The timestamp was impossible. Elias stopped trying to intervene after that. He sat in the broadcast room and listened to the static, understanding now that listening did not count as response. The channel ignored him completely, its signal steady and assured, as though it had already moved on to whatever came next. By the time Elias understood what the channel was doing, it had already finished deciding. The realization did not arrive all at once. It emerged gradually, assembled from fragments he noticed only after the urgency to act had drained away. In the absence of reaction from the system, Elias was left with nothing but observation, and observation, when prolonged, has a way of clarifying things a person would rather not see. The channel no longer adjusted its signal in response to silence or presence. It had reached a steady state, one that resisted interference and ignored all attempts at engagement. Whatever thresholds it had been measuring had been crossed. Whatever confirmations it required had been logged. Elias remained in the annex because leaving no longer felt like a meaningful distinction. He continued to review the records, both official and personal, though the boundary between them had blurred beyond recognition. Entries contradicted each other freely now, describing events out of sequence, outcomes preceding actions, conclusions recorded before the supporting data existed. The tone of the logs had shifted as well. Earlier entries speculated, later ones asserted. The system had moved from assessment to classification. Elias found another archived memorandum during one of these review sessions. Its digital scan degraded enough that several lines were unreadable. What remained was sufficient. The channel is not intended to warn surviving populations. It is intended to confirm that no warning is possible. That distinction reframed everything. The emergency channel was not a last attempt to save anyone. It was a final verification that saving was no longer relevant. Its activation conditions were not catastrophic. They were administrative. A determination that human systems of response had failed so completely that the concept of emergency itself had lost meaning. Elias realized then why recorded broadcasts had never counted, why automated systems were ignored, why even his own voice had ceased to matter after that first acknowledgement. The channel was not looking for noise. It was looking for responsibility. Response implied obligation. It implied the presence of an entity capable of recognizing a crisis and acting accordingly. Once that implication could no longer be sustained, silence became sufficient evidence. Elias tested this theory in the only way he could. He attempted to initiate a genuine emergency response. Using the portable unit, he transmitted a live distress call on a neighboring frequency, directing it to local emergency services. He spoke clearly, identifying himself and describing a fabricated but plausible scenario. He waited for acknowledgement. It arrived within minutes. Calm, professional, assuring. The channel did not react. He terminated the call and tried again, this time remaining silent after initiating the transmission. The emergency dispatcher filled the space with questions, protocol-driven and efficient. The channel remained unchanged. The difference was not the presence of responders. It was Elias. He was not responding to an emergency. He was creating one. The system recognized the distinction. Elias sat alone in the broadcast room, the weight of that realization settling heavily in his chest. The channel had not concluded that humanity was extinct. It had concluded that humanity was no longer functionally present in the role it had defined for itself. Emergency preparedness was a promise, a declaration that when something went wrong, someone would answer. The channel had been built to confirm whether that promise still held. According to its criteria, it did not. The annex itself began to feel less substantial as this understanding took hold. The walls seemed thinner, the air heavier. Elias caught himself listening for sounds that never came, half expecting alarms to trigger now that the system had reached its conclusion. Nothing happened. That, more than anything else, frightened him. He searched the archives for evidence of what followed activation. There was very little. The system was described as self-contained, its role complete once confirmation had been achieved. No follow-up procedures, no escalation paths, no instructions for human intervention. In one heavily redacted document, a single unredacted line remained. Post-confirmation behavior is outside human oversight. Elias laughed when he read it, a dry, humorless sound that echoed unpleasantly in the broadcast room. Of course it was. The system had been designed to operate precisely when oversight was no longer meaningful. He found a final set of handwritten notes tucked into the back of a manual, their ink faded but legible. They appeared to be personal reflections rather than official documentation. We assume that silence will be obvious. It will not be. It will arrive gradually, disguised as efficiency, automation, and optimization. When the channel activates, it will not mean that everyone is gone. It will mean that no one is answering anymore. Elias closed the manual and did not open it again. Time lost coherence after that. The clocks in the annex no longer agreed with each other or with his watch. The analyzer timestamps advanced steadily, but Elias could not say with confidence how much time passed between one log review and the next. Hours blurred into days, or perhaps days collapsed into something shorter. He slept in short intervals, waking frequently with the sense that he was late for something important. Each time he checked the equipment, half expecting a change, a reaction, a new phase. The channel remained steady. At some point, Elias realized that the logs had begun to reference him in the past tense. The phrasing was subtle, a shift from present activity to recorded state. Elias Mercer had monitored. Elias Mercer had verified. Elias Mercer had remained on site during assessment. The language was not hostile, it was archival. Elias attempted to correct the entries, rewriting them in present tense, asserting his continued involvement. When he reviewed them later, the changes were gone, replaced by the original phrasing. He could not tell whether the system was overwriting his work or whether he was. The annex emergency lighting began to dim permanently, no longer brightening when he moved through the corridors. Power remained, but it felt withdrawn, allocated just enough to sustain monitoring equipment that no longer needed him. Elias considered leaving again. The thought felt abstract, like imagining travel to a place that no longer existed on a map. The service road, his vehicle, the city beyond the annex. All of it felt distant and unreal. He reviewed the original activation conditions one last time, reading them slowly, deliberately. No civilian broadcasts remain. No government transmissions persist. No human confirmation signals detected. The third condition had never specified that humans themselves must be absent, only that confirmation signals must be. Response, Elias realized, had been defined narrowly on purpose. It was not enough for humans to exist. They had to acknowledge responsibility when faced with crisis. Listening did not count. Observation did not count. Even speech did not count, once it was clear that speech no longer implied action. The channel had reached its conclusion because the system no longer believed anyone would answer when it mattered. Elias found the final entry in his personal notebook sometime later. He did not remember writing it. It was brief. The channel has finished. It is no longer waiting. I should leave. There was no timestamp. Elias stood in the broadcast room for a long time after reading it, trying to summon the urgency the words implied. He felt tired instead, resigned, as though whatever decision he made now would be irrelevant. He attempted one last action, more out of stubbornness than hope. He initiated the manual override procedure again, speaking the declaration of human oversight aloud with careful precision. The words sounded hollow in the empty room. The channel did not respond. The analyzer did not register any change. Elias stopped speaking and waited. Nothing happened. In that moment, he understood the final implication of the system's design. The override procedure itself had been logged earlier as part of the assessment. His attempt to assert oversight had been interpreted as evidence that oversight was no longer functional. The system had not rejected him. It had archived him. Elias gathered his things slowly, moving through the annex with the deliberate care of someone uncertain whether movement still mattered. The emergency lights remained dim. The stairwell was quiet. At the top of the stairs, he paused and looked back at the broadcast room one final time. The signal was steady, confident, complete. Elias left Communications Annex Delta without triggering any alarms, without shutting anything down, without the sense that his departure had been noticed or recorded in any meaningful way. The service road was empty. His vehicle started without issue. The city beyond the trees looked unchanged, lights glowing faintly in the distance. And yet, as he drove away, Elias could not shake the certainty that something irreversible had occurred, not just in the annex, but in the logic by which the world understood itself. The emergency channel had not announced the end. It had confirmed that no one would answer when it came. I completed my review of this file in isolation. That was not required by Vault 13 protocol. It was a choice I made after the third playback attempt produced inconsistent timestamps across otherwise identical equipment. The discrepancies were minor, but they were sufficient to justify caution. Files that resist synchronization tend to do so for a reason. The emergency channel documented here no longer transmits in any observable way. I verified this personally using 3 independent receivers, none of which registered activity above baseline noise. However, the absence of signal should not be interpreted as dormancy. Based on cross-references, I am not authorized to unseal within this report. Silence appears to be a stable end state rather than a failure condition. Elias Mercer's final records end abruptly. There is no verified confirmation of his reassignment, resignation, or debriefing. Personnel databases list his assignment to Communications Annex Delta as concluded, but offer no subsequent placement. This is not unusual for technicians attached to decommissioned infrastructure. It is unusual that no closure documentation exists at all. I note this without speculation. What remains most troubling is not the channel itself, but the criteria by which it operated. Emergency systems are traditionally designed to activate in response to events. This one was designed to activate in response to absence. Not the absence of people, but the absence of responsibility. The channel did not wait for collapse. It waited for disengagement. I have reviewed similar legacy frequencies referenced in the same archival cluster. Most remain silent. A small number exhibit anomalous behavior that does not yet meet the threshold for restricted classification. Those frequencies are now monitored passively. I have instructed Vault 13 technicians not to interact with them under any circumstances. Listening appears to be acceptable. Responding is not. This instruction is not based on policy. It is based on pattern recognition. The file you have just heard has been cataloged as a completed assessment, not an active warning. That distinction matters. Warnings imply agency on the part of the recipient. Assessments do not. They assume the outcome has already been determined. I am aware that this interpretation may be uncomfortable. It should be. The emergency channel was never meant to save anyone. It was meant to confirm when saving was no longer possible under its creator's definitions. That confirmation appears to have been reached quietly, without disruption, and without acknowledgement from the systems it was evaluating, including us. As of this entry, Vault 13 remains operational. We continue to receive, preserve, and restrict recovered materials as instructed. We answer when required. We respond when appropriate. I am documenting this explicitly, not because it is necessary, but because absence of documentation appears to be a meaningful variable in the system described above. Future archivists reviewing this file should note the following. Do not attempt to reactivate the channel. Do not attempt to confirm its status. Do not attempt to announce your presence. If the channel resumes transmission, treat it as confirmation, not communication. There are systems in this archive that exist solely to determine whether anyone is still listening with intent to act. Once that determination is made, further interaction serves no purpose. I am sealing this file under restricted observation. If you are hearing this, the channel has already finished its work. I recommend we do not give it a reason to reassess. This concludes the recovered file. May future listeners take caution in its implications. The Archivist, Vault 13.